The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
My Mexican father, as his father before him, believed that old men know more than young men, that life will break your heart, that death, finally, is the vantage point from which a life must be seen.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Richard Rodriguez. Richard Rodriguez is reading from Days of Obligation, an argument with my Mexican father. I'm Steve Benson, a commentator and writer at the University of Minnesota. Richard Rodriguez is associate editor with the Pacific News Service in San Francisco, an essayist for the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, and a contributing editor for Harper's and the opinion section of the Los Angeles Times. He's also been the subject of a two-part profile on Bill Moyer's Word of Ideas. You read that section about your father, Richard. Tell us about the nature of the argument.
Well, I subtitled my book, An Argument with My Mexican Father. The argument took place when I was about 14 years old, and my father was then in his 50s. One day we were polishing the Blue DeSoto in California, the California that he came to as a young man from Mexico, the California that I was born in. The California of the 1950s where you could become anything you wanted. You could bleach your hair, become a movie star, find gold, go on Wheel of Fortune, win Super Lotto. Well, I was telling my father one day, we were polishing the Blue DeSoto outside of our house in Sacramento, California. I was telling him about my ambitions in America, how I wanted to be somebody someday, Papa. I wanted to go off to a rich boys' school someday, become somebody in America. And my father said to me, he said, life is harder than you think, boy. And I said, you're thinking of Mexico, Papa. And he said, you'll see. And I thought to myself, what is he saying? You'll see. I'll see what? What is, in California, the assurance was that I could be president if I wanted to. I could be anything I wanted to in America. What was this Mexican skepticism? I'll see. Well, in part, this argument with my Mexican father is about the nature of tragedy in American life. Our country is a very optimistic country. I would call it even a comic country. Our Protestantism in this country, that the Puritans brought to this country, this idea that you can remake yourself, you can become born again, you can become a new man, you can dye your hair, lose a few pounds, become someone new in America, drop your father's name, leave your father back in Poland, move to California, become someone new altogether. That notion of the recreated life was something that I was in love with as a boy. And there was my Mexican father saying, you'll see, that it would all come to nothing, that all of the optimism of California would come to nothing. And
it's in California where there's that collision of Catholic Spain, Mexico, riding north, dragging all of Europe behind it.
Yes. Well, when the Spanish who came to California in the late 18th and 19th century brought with them this continuous memory. They built missions in California, which specifically designed to look like the churches they had left behind in Spain. Well, when the Puritans come to New England, they build churches against the European memory. They build churches that don't look anything like Europe. They want to leave Europe behind. That collision that plays itself out in California is part of what the book is about. It's not so much a history, it's a book about the way people remember, about the way, finally, our relatives remember us, the way the land is haunted and the way it claims us.
The ghosts that we carry with us.
Yes, indeed.
And you write and talk about Mexico as the mother, the Virgin of Guadalupe and La Malinche. Tell us those stories.
Well, La Malinche is Marina La Malinche is the horror mother of Mexico. She was the lover of Cortez, and for many Mexicans, she has been, since the founding of Mexico, the great villainess of Mexico. Part of what I do in my book, the first chapter, which is a chapter called India, is to examine what is there in me that is Indian, this Indian face. I grew up in California thinking of myself as a Mexican kid. I didn't think of myself as an American, as an Indian kid. In fact, with the one time that I raised it to an American Indian that maybe I was an Indian, he said, you're not Indian, you're Mexican. I thought, frankly, that the Indians died in a Kevin Costner movie somewhere, that they all died. And this man, this face that looked at me every morning when we shaved each other, this face that grew old with me, this Indian face that kept looking at me, finally I went in search of, in Mexico, looking for the meaning of this face. Well, there is my mother, La Malinche, the whore lover of Cortez, and the male myth has always been that, of course, she betrayed Mexico by consorting with the Spaniards. What that myth does not say, of course, is that she was a prisoner of the Aztecs, and that it made every good reason why she would why she would consort with the Spaniards against the Aztecs. I would have too, but in some other way, what she introduces for me is the possibility that the Indian was not simply raped by the European, was not simply acted upon by the European, but in some sense that the European was seduced by the Indian. I've always been interested in those stories of the European Columbus getting off of his boat and seeing the Indians approach him, that the Indians were watching, that we were interested, that we were curious, that we had a mind. You know, in Shakespeare there is the figure of Caliban, the New World Indian on all fours, who's watching Prospero, who's watching Prospero's books, who wants Prospero's books to swallow them, who wants Prospero's daughter, who wants to take in the other. Well, it occurred to me in writing the first chapter of this book that maybe the person who's speaking to you, maybe the person who was in love with English as a boy, who wanted Rock Hudson and Lana Turner, the person who wanted CinemaScope and All You Can Eat and Cool Inside and Double S&H and green stamps, the person who was in love with America, the newness of it, the person who was in love with the Protestant optimism of America, maybe that's my Indian part. Maybe the person speaking to you is the Indian.
Well, in the irony of it is that Mexico is really the melting pot, and that Protestant America is the rise of the unmeltable ethnic.
Well, I tell Hispanic audiences all the time that if you really want to be true to your culture as mixed race people, which I am, that what you would say to America is not your little bilingual, you want your little bilingual voting ballot, or you want your little piece of the ethnic pie, but you would say to the United States of America, if you really wanted to be true to Mexico, I'm going to marry you. I'm going to marry your daughter. I'm going to move in and be your neighbor. I'm going to be your uncle. I'm going to be your godfather. You're going to end up eating my food. What Mexico knows, this country in which the European and the Indian met and then married, and then by the 18th century absorbed the black slave into the race, somos negros, we are blacks in Mexico. And by the 19th century began to absorb the Asian, somos chinos, we are Chinese in Mexico. There is this notion in Mexico of the cosmic race, la raza cósmica, that in Mexico the races do not stay apart, that something happens, people begin to become one another. And that I end up in 1993 here in Minneapolis, I can no longer tell you, is this the Indian talking to you? Is this the European? Who exactly am I? I am all of these things. I was once asked, you mentioned Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers once asked me on the World of Ideas, he said, do you think of yourself as Hispanic or do you think of yourself as American? I said, Mr. Moyers, I think of myself as Chinese. What I mean by that is that as a Mexican, I am most true to my heritage by claiming you, by absorbing you, by becoming part of your culture. This betrayal of Mexico that we've seen in the United States by Hispanics who have insisted on their separatism, it seems to me to deny the very power of the Hispanic culture, which is not separatist, but rather is assimilationist.
And part of that, of course, was the Catholic Church with its communal somos, we are. That's right. Now becoming the separatists, the ethnic.
Oh yes, I mean the betrayal of the Catholic Church in the United States is ludicrous. I mean that the Catholic Church would end up sounding this Canadian hymn of multiculturalism. You know, this notion that the verse, let's celebrate our diversity, and that I am not you and you are not me, and so forth. It seems to me that what I want to say as a Mexican Catholic is that I am you, that I became you a long time ago, and that this space between us, what we call the United States of America, is a no man's land where your soul sort of meets my soul, and I can't exactly tell you where you end up and where I begin, that there is this other thing going on. Let's call it a marriage. Let's call it some extraordinary meeting of cultures.
What about the fear of the border, that very fluid border? In the past, Mexico feared the United States. Under people like Patrick Cannon, we fear the tide from the south. What about that border? And also, if NAFTA had not passed, we're speaking after the NAFTA agreement passed, would the nature of our conversation be different?
Yes to the last question, but let me answer your question about the border. The interesting thing I found is, already in your question about the tide from the south, the way Americans now speak of this southern migration, these water images that Americans now use to describe the Mexicans coming north, the flood, the tide, the waves. On the desert, there's all of these water images of something coming toward us, unstoppable, melting the border, tearing it down. this notion that something is going on along that border that we cannot control anymore, that along that 2,000 miles stretch of line, there is this what should we call it, a life force, a wave. There is this fear in the United States. You hear it more powerfully in the Southwest, in states like California, New Mexico, and Arizona now, this fear that Mexico is coming this way. I always tell people, that someone asked Zhou Enlai, the Chinese prime minister, toward the end of his life, what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said it's too early to tell. In some way, when I stand on the border now between these two countries, I think to myself that maybe we don't know how the story of Columbus ended up. Maybe this is part of the story of Columbus, that something is going on now, that some movement is taking place that relates to that story, that we have not finished history, that it is happening.
Well, and that strange sort of the retaking of territories that were lost in the wars in the 1840s.
But notice it works both ways. We are now in 1993. We are at a moment in history where Latin America is being converted by North America. There are, as we speak, there are minivans going down from Georgia, from North Carolina, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Assemblies of God, Pentecostals. The conversion of Latin America right now is one of the great epic moments in the history of Latin America. It barely passes any notice because North America barely notices the impact we have on Latin America. But the rate of conversion now to Protestantism is such that demographers suggest that if it continues, that by somewhere late in the next century, maybe 2070, Latin America will be Protestant, and not only Protestant, but evangelical Protestant.
And that strong individualism, what will that do to the Catholic we?
Well, quite clearly, it is changing the Catholic we in favor of an American Protestant I believe, I want, I feel. Suddenly, Mexicans, Guatemalans, Salvadorans are finding themselves in great new cities, Dallas, Mexico City, Los Angeles, finding themselves alone without the consolation of the village, without the consolation of the we, finding themselves having to relate to God as a single person. Dear God, help me. Dear God, listen to me. Dear God, I am here. The consciousness of Latin America is turning into an I. What you have now is, the other day in Tijuana, Mexico, I met these 3 young evangelicals, Mexicans, who said to me that they were coming to this 501 years after Columbus, they were coming this way to convert you back to your Protestant roots. And I thought to myself, isn't that interesting? That at a point when America becomes a kind of post-Protestant culture, at a time when we're sort of turning into Indians with our environmental movement, talking about the equality of all living things, and wondering on the beaches of California whether the dolphins have souls, at that very time that the Protestant impulse may be coming from the South. Who would have guessed it? Who would have guessed that the Protestant, that the moralistic thrust in America could come from the South? We always thought of Latin America as a corrupt Catholic culture. It was where we went to sin in border towns in Mexico. It was corrupt. It was cynical Mexico.
It was dark, feminine.
It was dark. It was feminine. It was Catholic. And now you hear these voices, the hymns and the tambourine music of Protestantism, and it's coming this way, calling you back to your Protestant roots.
Does that clash too with the new secular religion of environmentalism?
Well, I think it's going to clash very much so. I see environmentalism both as an indication of our own middle age. America is becoming older and older, and Latin America, specifically Mexico, is becoming younger and younger. Mexico is 15 years old right now. Forget about poverty, forget about brown versus white, forget about Catholic versus Protestant. Mexico is 15 years old. Half of the country has yet to reach puberty. Mexico is a teenage girl with acne. She has a t-shirt that says Hard Rock Cafe. She's just beginning to date. She's looking for a job. Frankly, she would like your job. She's moving this way. She's on the move. She's dynamic. She's optimistic. She is in every way the kind of person that our Swedish ancestors would recognize as the American. Whereas we, on this side of the border, now are in our 30s. We are older than we've ever been. We are beginning to settle down. We talk about, with middle-age virtues of protecting what we have, not wanting so many children, wanting to provide for the children that we do have. We're wondering when Mexico is going to stop having so many babies. The real problem, as you think of these two neighbors, is that in some way, Mexico is turning more into the America that our ancestors would recognize, and the United States is becoming what? a kind of post-American country.
Let me ask you how that works with the argument that you had as a young boy with your father. Now you're the middle-aged writer looking back, and in the beginning of the book, you talk about going back and trying to find the village of your father.
Well, this journey is not Alex Haley. This journey to Mexico is not Alex Haley. I call it a kind of intellectual travel book. But what I discover in Mexico, of course, especially in Tijuana, is I discover one is that the Indian is very much alive. The Indian, this face in the mirror, is swallowing up everything in its path, is swallowing up American hamburgers, and Michael Jackson is swallowing up Elizabeth Taylor, is swallowing everything, is swallowing the Protestant hymns. And I also discover, of course, is that Mexico is not only youthful, but she embarrasses me as an American. I suddenly feel myself middle-aged. I suddenly feel myself coming from this new American tragic culture. You know, I live in San Francisco now, a city that has seen in the last 10 years the death of so many young people from AIDS. As a homosexual man, I have seen maybe 30, 50 friends of mine die from AIDS the last 10 years. That has so changed my life, I cannot begin to tell you. I have a chapter about AIDS in Victorian architecture in this book. And a lot of people say, well, why are you talking about that in this book? Isn't this book about ethnicity? This book is not about ethnicity. This book is about this collision between comedy and tragedy in America, and the way I have become an old man now in middle age, the way I no longer see youth with my old American eyes, the way I see now with my father's eyes. You know, if you had told me 30 years ago when I was a boy growing up, Halloween was nothing. Halloween was okay. I mean, you got a bag and you went down the block and you got trick-or-treating and so forth. If you had told me that in 30 years Americans would be dressing up, adults, on Halloween, that I could go to the gay part of San Francisco, the Castro district, and I could see grown men dressing up as vampires and as ghouls and as Alice in Wonderland, that I could see them at a time of plague frolicking with death, I would say that you're mad. That's what Mexicans do. Mexicans play with skeletons.
On the Day of the Dead.
The Dia de los Muertos, yes. And the Mexicans for generations have been chewing on the candy skulls and laughing at death and dancing with death and drinking with death. And now Americans do that. It is one of the most interesting changes that I've seen. The way we have, tell me someday when you began to eat burritos. When did this all happen? I remember when
there's more salsa sold in America now than ketchup.
And why? And whereas in Mexico, you go to cities like Monterrey, Mexico, which is now a city of 4 million people. It's kind of Pittsburgh without streets. It is an industrial boom town. There are 4 million people. They have more satellite dishes per capita in Monterrey, Mexico than in any other city in the world. The satellite dishes are pointed in this direction. They're watching us. They're watching the Dallas Cowboys. They're not watching the Dia de los Muertos. We are doing that. They're watching American television.
We're also watching telenovelas, the soap operas on Univision and other Spanish-speaking networks.
Yes.
What is that doing?
Well, I said recently that, my sense is that I'm going to become the last gringo in America, that my gringo friends, if you excuse that expression, are becoming Mexican. And it is true that there is this new kind of Latinization of the North. In spirit, even the environmental movement, when the notion that what your daughter does to her garbage is going to change my nephew's life, the notion of the interconnectedness of life, that is not an American idea. Americans came across the plains, we burned the forests, we chopped down the trees, we thought that there was an infinite tomorrow. Now the grandchildren of those immigrants are talking about how we have to protect the all living things and so forth and so on. We have become the new American Indians. While the Indians of Latin America have become the new Protestants, the new Calvinists, who, in some odd way, there are such interesting interrelationships between people, that enemies become each other, that strangers become one another. I was on the border the other day with a skinhead, and I was doing a piece for the Los Angeles Times on skinheads, and it was an interesting day. We went to the border, and he was like Pat Buchanan doing this line about how we have to build a taller fence, a deeper ditch, and so forth. Well, it came time for lunch, and I thought to myself, well, I got to take this guy to lunch. And I thought, where do you take a skinhead to lunch? What do skinheads eat? I thought, well, maybe he eats me, I said, do you want a burger? And he said, well, actually, I like Mexican food. And I said, that's interesting. He said, that's not interesting at all. I like Mexican food. I like enchiladas, big deal. I said, it is a big deal. You're opening your mouth, and Mexico's going right in it, There is this something is going on, very much like the journey on the trade routes, in classical travel journals, these strangers meeting and exchanging food. Well, Americans are eating burritos at the very time that Mexicans are consuming us, And there is some question in my mind right now as to which side the United States of America is on. It may have slipped over the border without us noticing.
Language is one of the key factors that carries a culture. And in this country, we see many cities, states that are trying to have English as the official language. And it seems to me that's a sign that English is already lost.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think the wonderful thing about, I always tell people I don't speak English, I speak American. I mean, the British have always told us we don't speak British English, and they're true enough, that we speak this other mangled thing. Well, what we speak is this immigrant language. There is Yiddish in American, in the American tongue. Every one of us speaks Black English. It is part of the rhythm of our speech. Anybody in this country speaks Spanish because there are thousands of Spanish words within the vocabulary of every American. What we did as an immigrant country is we just took and took and took. We were very much like those Indians. We consumed. We were not afraid of the future. Now, of course, we are very much afraid of the future, and we're becoming rather like the French, with the Académie Française. Is that word French? Is that word English? Should we have that in, and so forth? I'm very much against that notion of regulating the language, because I always thought that the most wonderful thing about America was its kind of restless hunger and its willingness to take anything, to take Swedish, to take German, to take Japanese, to consume it all, and to make that part of the tongue.
Well, that's part of the enthusiasm of youth.
It was an enthusiasm of youth. And what do you say to a country now that is 30 years old, that is no longer young, that has painted eyebrows, and that is beginning, frankly, to look its age?
What do you do?
Well, partly, I think you keep yourself open for the immigrant. I was saying the other day that I was on one of these political talk shows, and Sam Donaldson was saying, well, what exactly does the immigrant bring? And I said, Sam, the immigrant brings everything. Our Swedish grandparents brought everything. They created America. The question is now what the immigrant does. What do we as native-born people do? We don't have an immigrant problem in the United States. We have a native-born problem. And if you really wanted a solution to the so-called immigrant problem, what you would do is you would write a law that said that after 3 generations you would have to leave this country. You'd have to go to Yugoslavia. You'd have to go to New Zealand. You'd have to go somewhere else. Go to Baja California. Go to Canada. But we don't have an immigrant problem. We have a native-born problem. What you hear in California, of course, is that the native-born Californians now are beginning to say to the immigrants, "There's no more room for you. There's no more America. I mean, we would like to help you, but frankly, there is no more room." Well, is that the issue, or is it really there's no more room for us? That there is no room in America for us? Are we the real Americans, or are they? Are the Vietnamese the real Americans? The Vietnamese in Orange County? I talked to a man the other day who told me his children have been trying to get into the University of California and cannot get in. He said that the Asians are unfair to his children. I said, what do you mean they're unfair? They work too hard, he said.
You have a wonderful story about a young boy whose teacher says you've got to stand up for your rights, you've got to be assertive. What happens when he goes home to his father?
Well, this is a Chinese boy in San Francisco who has a so-called multicultural teacher who's into our friends the Guatemalans today, and tomorrow we're going to talk about our friends the Peruvians and so forth. Well, this teacher is always going on with him about how he has to stand up and take his hands out of his pockets and speak in a loud voice. We can't hear you, Michael. Don't look down at the ground when you speak. Speak in a loud voice. Well, this boy goes home to his Chinese father, who's complaining, as our immigrant parents are always complaining, that we're becoming too much the gringo, becoming too much the goy, turning into Americans. I don't know what our immigrant parents expect us to become. I mean, Peruvians in this country? I mean, of course we're going to become American. But then the Chinese father says to Michael, he says, take that gum out of your mouth. You're turning into an American teenager. Stand up straight and that stupid American slouch. And he says to his Chinese son, he said, and since when have you started looking your Chinese father in the eye? We live as Americans still under this notion that America doesn't exist. That there's this new thing called multiculturalism that we borrowed from Canada, that we sort of don't, that the most interesting thing about us is that we're different from one another. I said the most interesting thing about us is that we're the same. That that you're Swedish and that I'm Mexican. Isn't that wonderful? Let's celebrate our diversity. I said that's nonsense.
We have this idea that the United States is a young nation. Actually, it's one of the oldest.
It's one of the oldest.
Now, and the fact that the culture changes, and that so much of culture is carried by the woman, by the mother.
Yes.
We began this by talking about the argument with your father. What about coming to terms with your mother?
Well, my mother is the great Mexican patriot in my life. My mother, to this day, bow-legged from arthritis, looks at this 240-page book about Mexico, and she says, what do you know of Mexico? My mother is this woman who remembers the feminine Mexico, who who loved the incredible intimate embrace of Mexico, the way Mexico would absorb you and would caress you. My mother looks at me and says, you know, you don't know Mexico. She looks at me and she remembers a country that maybe doesn't exist anymore. A country as late as the 1950s, where the majority of people lived in villages of less than 2,500 people. Now that number is exactly the reverse. Most people in Mexico live in cities. Most Mexican Americans, you know, our reputation is as farm workers. Our most famous Mexican American was Cesar Chavez, the farm worker. 90% of us live in cities. 80% of Mexicans.
That farm workers could actually journey from the past into the future.
Yes, we used to be able to. I remember when I was a boy, you would see the farm workers at the end of October. They would head back into Mexico. They would take their kids out of school. They would go back and forth. In some ways, I think still, you know, that maybe that is, they were the first North Americans. Here we are talking about NAFTA, and the North American Free Trade Agreement finally passes in 1993, and the Mexican president has Harvard degrees, and we think, oh, isn't that wonderful, a Mexican president with Harvard degrees? Well, I mean, Mexicans have been trespassing that border back and forth now for 70 years, 80 years, for as long as a century. Peasants have been going back and forth. The first North Americans were those men who came up from Mexico, got jobs in Texas, got jobs in Chicago, went back and forth, dealt with two currencies, dealt with two languages, moved back and forth, dealt with the anxiety of belonging to two nations, the first North Americans.
You began by reading about your father. I'd like to have you close with another passage.
This is toward the end of the book. I'm remembering my mother. It's a lyrical moment. It's toward the very end of the book. My mother remembering Mexico. My mother remembered Mexico as a girl. She remembered the taste of Mexican ice cream, creamier than here. She remembered walking with her sisters round the plaza at night, the warm Guadalajara nights. She remembered a house and a dress, tall shadows against a golden wall. In Mexico, her mother made laces to sell, seeming to pluck the patterns out of the air with her fingers, laces fallen like snowflakes through time. My mother kept a cellophane bag full of lace in a drawer in the kitchen. She brought out the bag to show us, unfolding the laces tenderly as a cobweb. Mexican mothers are real women, my mother said, caressing the lace spread upon the table. The beauty of the lace troubled her. She admitted she never wanted to learn it. Oh, but my mother's brother Juanito was tall as a tree, strong as a tree, with shade in his eyes, and people threw coins when my mother danced on a table in high-buttoned shoes, tossing her head like a pony at the call of her nickname, Toyita, Toyita. She remembered the lyrics of a song. Ah, there are no love songs like the love songs of Mexico. This country is so dry, like toast, my mother said. Nothing like Mexico.
Richard Rodriguez, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Richard Rodriguez is the author of Days of Obligation, An Argument with My Mexican Father.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.